Marketing through sports in China. Now this is thoughtful. Hello, I'm Trevor Lai in Shanghai. China has produced some great athletes like Yao Ming, Liu Xiang, and Li Na. But its sports industry is still state-run and less friendly to marketers compared to the West's brand-savvy teams, leagues, and players. That's changing as athletes like Li Na forged their own path outside the state system, and the sports followed and played by Chinese expands. International sports leagues and associations are beginning to make inroads into China too. This week on Thoughtful China, China Youthology's Kevin Lee, Mailman's Andrew Collins, and TBWA's Catherine Talpe will help you understand where China's sports industry offers opportunities to grow your brands. And Lululemon's Jen Lung will share a thought or two about how Chinese are starting to adopt new sports like yoga. But first, with us is Rob Mills, Director and CEO of the Gemba Group, a sports and entertainment advisory that works extensively across Asia Pacific. Rob, thanks for coming to our studio today.
Thank you.
Why don't you start by telling us about what Gemba is doing in China?
Yeah, we've been in China since 2006, so we started working in the lead up to the Olympics. Our main focus is working with major brands who are making significant investments in sport and entertainment. So in the lead up to the Olympics, we worked extensively with Adidas in helping them set up both their strategy and their licensing strategy for the Beijing Olympics. And we've subsequently worked with Quicksilver, Oakley, ANZ Bank, and also Adidas as well. So we sort of have a very diverse range of clients who've got different investment strategies. We also run a very large-scale consumer research program that's looking at how Chinese are engaging in sport and entertainment. So that's a really pivotal part of our advice to brands, is that consumer research.
So both sides of the puzzle,
yeah.
And you have a particularly insightful view of pre-Olympics and post-Olympics.
Yeah.
So talk to us about how the level of sophistication in sports marketing and sponsorship, how has that changed since pre-Olympics till now?
Yeah, look, it's definitely increased as you would expect. I think the Olympics was a fantastic sort of toe in the water for a lot of brands sponsoring. It's still progressing. I think we've got to keep remembering that Chinese sport is only quite young. If we compare, say, the CSL to the China Soccer League or Super League with, say, the EPL, the NBA. The EPL's been around since the 1880s, the NBA since the 1940s, but really professional football in this market's only a 20-year-old concept. So the whole sort of concept of commercialisation and professionalisation in sport is still relatively new. So it is progressing, and it made a quantum leap after the Beijing Olympics, but it's quite exciting about where it will be in the next 20 years, we think.
Can you talk about some athletes within China whose stock is rising right now?
Look, there's quite a few, and I should have asked our insights team some specific names. I think what we're probably looking at is not only the athletes, but we're also looking at the sport. So to go back one point on that question, probably the first thing we do is talk to a brand about, well, which sports are rising. So, for instance, basketball's a really interesting one in China at the moment because it's got a very young consumer profile. So when we look at the people who are engaged between 16 and 25, there's a very high proportion of them engaged in basketball. Now, if we compare that to, say, table tennis and badminton, which have been sort of the more traditional Chinese sports, while they're still very strong, they have a more ageing consumer profile. So what we're sort of seeing is that this group of young people are going to come through that sport over the next 5, 10, 20 years, and that sport's going to grow and grow. Now, within that, we would then get our insights team to go, okay, who are the hot ones coming up within basketball, and look for those individual athletes that, again, have to fit with the brand's image as well. It's great to have a young and upcoming athlete, but if you're looking for a very sort of good spokesperson, you may not want this very irreverent, sort of edgy player. So there's a little bit of, it's not just about how good they are on court, it's also about sort of what they are as an off-court package as well.
How do you brands and audiences respond to Chinese athletes that are overseas?
Yeah, I think increasingly well. I think I was fortunate enough to be in Melbourne during the Australian Open final this year, and anecdotally, the reaction on social media to Li Na's acceptance speech was absolutely incredible. I think it was trending for a long time around Australia, and I think her poise and as her English has got better, her humour really came through so well in that speech. So anecdotally, the social media reaction was amazing. Looking at our numbers in Australia now, about 25% of Australians have a really high degree of favourability to Li Na, and that's a really high number for a foreign athlete. So I think increasingly as Chinese sport gets exposed around the world, and obviously Chinese sport's been incredibly successful, we're going to see more global symbols. You know, we saw it with Yao Ming in the NBA. I think we're now seeing it with Li Na. So I think that's a really interesting sort of build on where Chinese sport is at the moment.
Do you see any challenges or obstacles that are still perhaps hindering or could be an obstacle to future growth in terms of sponsorship and sports marketing in China?
Look, I think it probably goes back to what I said before about professional sport is still a relatively new concept in China, and I think it's easy to forget that when the markets move so quickly and it's such a big market. So I think the implication in terms of that is the probably commercialisation capability is not where it needs to be. So I think, and a good example of that is probably what the Chinese Basketball Association's done. So the CBA is actively engaged Infront, who's a global management group who specialises in commercialising sponsorship and broadcast deals. They've brought Infront in to help their commercialisation program. So I think and if you think about why that's happened, because government's been such a large funder of sport, the sports really haven't had to build that commercial capability, whereas in a market like the US or the UK or Australia, they've had to be commercial beasts for a long time. So I think as that commercial capability grows within the sports, that will also present some really exciting opportunities to brands, because those sports will be better sort of set up to deliver those commercial rights.
Rob, thanks very much for coming in today.
Pleasure, thank you.
Let's take a break to hear from our sponsor. When we come back, Jen Lung will share a thought or two about the rise of new sports in China.
Let's go!
The demographics of personal sports fitness in China are changing rapidly. We've seen in less than a decade that those table tennis and badminton facilities often found in workplaces shift to world-class gym equipment and yoga mats. Picture when Shanghai joins the ranks of Bali, New York, and Vancouver to become one of the world's go-to yoga hubs. In a city of 21 million then, seeing yogis bending and stretching in parks or compound laneways will be no surprise. Amongst one of the fastest growing sports, yoga challenges physical and mental limitations to push for outer strength and inner peace through every practice. And in China, given the fast-paced work life and city life, it is the perfect physical activity to unwind to and to tune in into internal perspectives. Like most sports, style in yoga is just as integral in Shanghai. You see sophisticated yogis around studios in the city. Their level of practice and dedication is unparalleled to Western cities. Having said that, there's still tremendous potential for yoga to unlock here. And at Lululemon, we're eager to bring more complementary events to empower yoga for all, regardless of income backgrounds, and to stand for quality and beautifully technical products so we can sweat and try more fun activities. Beyond businessmen and businesswomen and tourists, I can't wait to see more fit fanatics landing into Pudong Airport with yoga mats and sports duffels on their backs in the next few years. Namaste.
Thanks, Jen. With us now is Andrew Collins, Chief of Staff at Mailman, which develops social media strategies in China for global sports teams and athletes. Catherine Telpe, Business Director at TBWA Shanghai, the global ad agency for Adidas. And Kevin Lee, Chief Operating Officer at China Youthology, which advises Nike about China's youth market. Kevin and Andrew, thanks for coming back to Thoughtful China, and Catherine, welcome.
Thank you.
So let's start by looking at the industry perspective. For decades, China's sports industry has obviously been run by their Zhuguo system, following their planned economy. So moving forward, when you see examples like Li Na, who are breaking away from the system and having a lot of success overseas, do you think this is going to change and allow the free market to take more of a hold and evolve the system?
Well, I think she's a great example of someone who is not necessarily going with the system, but going against the system. And the benefits are pretty clear. She's performing at the top level. She's in the top 10 in the world. So the problem I think the system struggles with, it doesn't have enough evidence to support the system works to develop really credible international talent. So I know they're investing a lot, and there's a lot of things going on in terms of football and tennis, but until there is a good volume of professional athletes at an international level, the confidence in the system, I don't believe is there for young people.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, just in terms of listening to what young people talk about when they see these athletes, I mean, obviously they cheer for them. I mean, there is, of course, pride there and hope that they achieve. But the conversation around young people, spectators or people that are considering going into sports, the majority are like, no, I'd never touch that. I would never ever touch that. The reason because they know very clearly what the system entails, which is something that is almost more of a nightmare than the system that they're already in, an education system. So that's just, while they enjoy to watch it, they would never consider that path for themselves.
And what are some of the sports that you're seeing brands get excited about in China in terms of marketing?
I think the most popular sport in China right now is badminton, but the big brands like Nike and Adidas are supporting more running and basketball. Football or soccer is still quite far behind the position that it's in Europe. So basketball and running are really the big sports that the big brands are going after.
Is there a big build-up to the World Cup here in China?
There is. It's maybe not as big as, it's not as big as it is in Europe and South America, certainly, but, and with China not being in the World Cup, that makes a big difference. And the controversy around the Chinese national football team in recent years doesn't help. But there is a big build-up to it, and the bigger brands are supporting it quite heavily.
What do you attribute some of the success you mentioned in passing basketball? But we all know that the NBA has done a phenomenal job of reaching out and really, from bringing star athletes over to organizing tournaments and games. You know, what else do you attribute their success to in China?
Yeah, I think that obviously the just more access is important. I mean, more local access is very important. I think the core issue, the core breakthrough, I know that, you know, for the NBA and also the partner brands like Nike and their main supporters, they're looking at one core thing, which is how do we bring sport into a young person's life that's not just in this super organized way. You know, how do we bring it so that it's a playful thing? Because like we said in the last question, before it was just built as that national system, which is not a playful thing. That is a professional route, and that adds to great pressure and great stress for a young person. You know, thinking already at such an early age, do I want to invest my whole life into that? When what they really want are options. They want, different paths that they can go through because they're changing, they're exploring, and they don't know what the world is entailing. And so they want to have more options and leave more options on the table. To have the national route, just lock everything, all the other options away is very scary for them. And so going back to the NBA and brands like Nike, what they're trying to do is trying to give an alternative option to sport, not just a national one, not just a professional one, but a recreational one.
Yeah, the brands are bringing it down to as Kevin mentioned, the grassroots level, just to make it more accessible. Because up until recently, there just hasn't been accessible to kids in China. You don't have the public courts that you can walk onto, or in the schools, they don't offer it.
But have you seen any of the big international brands try to actively cultivate Chinese athletes, before they break through and win these titles? Because it's easy and typically they all line up and pile on afterwards. But when we look at college basketball, or we look at how Nike and Adidas, develop overseas, they really start early and they look at talent and they grow those personalities. So by the time they're playing, in college, they already have endorsements and deals in place and they're building that following. Is that happening here?
Yeah, well, they're trying. The thought is leading to that way. There are logistical hoops to jump through, and it's of course how far can a brand go. I mean, I know some brands, some athletic brands that during the Winter Olympics were thinking about how to showcase their endorsed stars, not just in their performance in the competitions, but of course how they were experiencing the Olympic Village and how they were, we see a lot of stories about training a lot, right? And that's cool, that is already off the court somewhat. but we can go beyond that. And so, there are stories about athletes like, snowboarders and skiers who, they were talking more about not just training and then winning competition, but about how they travel the world and see different things and pursue other hobbies while they're even doing their sports, like pursuing photography or pursuing something else. And about how, they're actually showing that even through sport, they can actually explore other parts of themselves. And that those are ideas that I know that brands are exploring. However, can they put the muscle behind it? Because it takes a lot, right? It takes a lot. I mean, number one, is that even in your contract with the person that you've signed? Can you do that? Do you have access to that? Number two, are they capable of doing that? Are they the right people to do that? Number three, are you capable of receiving that type of content? Can you actually use that content? Can you send the right team to go and support them? It takes a lot of logistics and a lot of commitment to do that. So brands are heading in that way, but it's easier said than done.
What are some of the tools that you've seen brands successfully use to garner this type of following or to build this sort of base?
Well, I mean, social media's obviously had a huge impact on the ability to communicate. An international brand, like you look at a sports team like, say, Liverpool Football Club, who we represent here, who were actually the first European football club on Chinese social media. And they were the first club to reach 1 million fans. It's a hugely active following. They've got fan groups all over the country that are being galvanized through through tools like social media to follow. And now you've got a huge rise of IPTV, a lot of online streaming channels. They're now giving a lot more access to different sporting channels. I mean, the Spanish league has grown incredibly, so has the German football league. So a lot more of these leagues and international levels of playing are getting a lot more exposure. I think the underlying problem is the average young person in China does not have the belief that it's possible to be a professional athlete like it is in the West. Like if you're a college kid, let's say you're a parent, you have a kid, you have aspirations of your child becoming a professional football star or tennis star, it doesn't really exist here. So I think that belief system, it's a cultural shift that has to change. That can only happen, maybe, it's a long time before that can be developed.
Yeah, I think it really is a structural issue here. In America, which is such a sports-centric culture, we have the college ball, we have the high school stars who you see are building a life and heading towards professional athletics. Again, like we mentioned here before, in China, because this death decision happens so early in life, you either go into athletics and then you just go into this deep dark hole, or you go into academics and sports just doesn't enter into your life. I mean, even now we're just trying to break into the idea of sports as recreation. So you can imagine that we're talking about building the grassroots. We're nowhere near a depth of grassrootsness that can bridge the gap between recreation and somewhere that's close enough to be entering into the professional realm. You have recreation for purely recreational sake, and none of those are good stories that are inspirational or aspirational that can come close to the level that we need in a professional athlete's level. So we don't have that here in China. You just have either one track or the other track. Extremes. Yeah. And there's nothing in the middle that is being filled in.
What's excited you recently about the sports marketing landscape here in China?
Oh, I think just with so many people getting into sport more and more, it's still at a very low and kind of infancy level, but more and more people are being exposed to it through the Western brands and through the local Chinese brands, and young people are getting to know how sport benefits them both socially and physically, and it's exciting. Things change so quickly here. It's really growing quickly. I ran in a race on Sunday, and there were about 5,000 people there, just an 8K race, all locals. It's exciting to see how quickly it's changing, and the interest that's developing in sport, and the clubs that are getting built up. It's nowhere near like it is in the West. Like we were just saying, the school, it's not in the schools. You're not exposed to it as a child. But it is growing, and it's changing quickly.
Were there any sponsors for this race?
No, there weren't. There were not, and I noticed that there was nothing.
But that's a great opportunity, though, and that's what happens. You've got brands like Nike who are using sport or an athlete as a tool to communicate their message and going on roadshows every year. LeBron comes over here every year. Kobe's here every year. I mean, Jeremy Lin's here every year. There's a ton of athletes coming over here, and it's fantastic for the brand because there's this wide open gap there that they can use, and there's a lot of digital content to access to this, and it's just they're incredible moments that people can connect with these athletes and stars. So it's fantastic for a brand.
And they're more than athletes at that point when they're here. I mean, they're more than celebrities at that point. You know, they're here for very many different reasons. It's somebody experiencing China, you know, who has great experience in other things and is now experiencing China and experiencing young people and meeting them in a new way. So it's very important. I'm thinking, you know, in terms of opportunities here. I think last year, you know, we had the Color Run, which was huge. The Color Run was a marathon that was put on. I think it was brand supported. I think it was New Balance. And what it was, you know, you run from one stop to the next, and at every stop you get these huge color fights where you just get powdered color and you just throw it at each other. By the time you finish the run, you are just head to toe in multicolor. And I mean, of course, super viral. And I mean, what that means is it's not even just about the running at that point. It's not even just about the self-improvement or even the recreation. It's become social fun. It's become self-expression. It's become a completely different way of understanding life. You know, and that is the key opportunity. If we can have more things like the Color Run, which completely is brand initiated, and just it really breaks through people's mindsets about what active life can be and what it can mean for them, you know, because it can mean so many things.
A few years ago, Chinese brands made headlines for trying to break into the overseas market, you know, setting up large operations, you know, even in sports apparel. Obviously, that didn't work out quite the way they expected, and they've come back here trying to retrench in this local market and finding that the bigger players have just gotten bigger. So what are some of the things that they can actually do you think, to reestablish themselves in their own market? I mean, if you look at other Asian markets, if you look at Korea, for example, their domestic brand's extremely strong across a variety of industries. Here, when we're talking about fashion, apparel, obviously there are some incumbents, but in sports specifically, there seems to be a fading, if you will, of some of the players that were perhaps hit their peak just before the Beijing Olympics. And since then have done the opposite of what people would have expected, which is they would have expected them to continue that momentum and build more, and in some ways we've seen some of them erode. So what do you think are some of the challenges and some of the solutions moving forward for those brands?
Well, I think I can comment on this if you like. Kevin will probably add more value, but I think that challenge about like there's not enough Chinese athletes performing well at international level, that has a direct impact on a foreigner's interest or aspiration to purchase a Chinese brand. Li-Ning's really struggled in the US. It's pulled out, right, or thereabout. But you know, so other brands in other areas like electronics are starting to create, you know, a great run. Like Xiaomi's doing a great job, of course. They're about to go global, and some other brands are doing it. But I think like sport in particular has a real problem for sporting goods, for a Chinese sporting goods brand. It's just way too competitive. And the price points are, I mean, it's still okay to go and buy a pair of Nikes in the US for $80. So how can they really compete with that? You know, I mean, you could buy a pair of $80 shoes, which is endorsed by Kobe Bryant, you know.
Yeah. I think it's also just a general trend across China, not only in sporting goods, but Western brands are the choice of Chinese consumers now. 10 years ago when Adidas and Nike were in the market for initially, all they had to do was put their product out in a store and it sold. And then the Chinese brands came in and then things changed. And now, as you said, the Chinese brands' importance has gone down quite a bit. And so now it's all about the Western brands. But it's across everything. It's across not just apparel and footwear, but food and cars and luxury goods. Everything is going Western.
Yeah, I think the elephant in the room when we talk about sports apparel is about sports fashion. The main issue, the main changes that have happened in the last couple of years here, if you look at the big brands, and we're talking about the big international brands, but we're also talking about how the Chinese brands are looking at this play, is this conversation or competition between sports as a sports brand as sports apparel or sports brand as fashion. And that really is the biggest thing when you look at Nike versus Adidas today. The markets, the way that they've captured their markets are very different today. The competition is very different. Why? Because Adidas and some other brands have started to realize that sports is fashion, street fashion, more than it is sports apparel. And so that really is the challenge today for perhaps other sports apparel brands who want to stick to it being sport or defining it as sport, whereas other brands that were traditionally sports apparel are moving much further into fashion. So they're not even taking athletes anymore, they're taking celebrities.
Right, and you're seeing, actual fashion designers like Stella McCartney, creating an entire line that's done very well here in China.
Yeah.
And that whole niche, which we mentioned earlier, the whole idea of performance being a defining factor for your brand is a really uphill battle for a lot of the domestic brands, especially since they don't have any shining examples to say, we are a good, authentic leader in this area of performance.
That's right.
So, fashion design could be an area that they could try to strengthen themselves in. Kevin, Andrew, Catherine, thanks for being on Thoughtful China. That wraps it up for today. Be sure to subscribe to us on Youku, Tudo, and YouTube. You can also follow us on Weibo and Twitter and join our LinkedIn group. We'll see you again.